Good morning to everybody. I'm very happy as a scholar in Czech studies to introduce to you Libora Oates-Indruchová, who is a professor of sociology of gender at the University of Graz in Austria, and who has studied and worked in several universities also abroad. I know about your PhD in Lancaster, UK, and I know about your work in Szeged, Hungary. And I'm actually very curious about Szeged because Szeged is the only major Hungarian city today to have a leftist mayor. So it has to be something special about Szeged now in Orban's Hungary. And well, your research fields are the cultural representations of gender and social change, censorship, and narrative research, with a special focus on Czech Republic. And the witness of this focus is this essay collection called The Politics of Gender Culture Under State Socialism that you call editing. And it's, for me, very interesting research work, dealing, a really multidisciplinary work, dealing with gender in socialism in Czechoslovakia from different perspectives, and structuring the analysis in two fields, gender as a social category and gender as a symbolic category. And you wrote for this part, gender as a symbolic category, about literature, what is for me very interesting as a literary scholar. And I really like the point you make at the end, of your research, of your article, saying that, socialism was a repressing system, but it indeed made something, or it led, let's say, to an enlargement of the discourse about women in Czechoslovakia, and also an enlargement of the representation of women over there. And you say, well, it was so for women, but not for men. So socialism didn't make enough, or didn't lead to an enlargement of the representation of men. And you suggest at the end of your article that it can be also a reason why an imported idea of man, the transnational businessman, was so successful after '89. And so for me it was a nice way to say why we have someone like Babiš today in his actual, let's say, image, masculinity image. Of course there is also a socialist past for Babiš, we could speak about, but I really like the point. And the last thing I would like to say about you is that you have this interest in gender in Czechoslovakia, in Czech Republic today, but you also try to put it in context of all, let's say, East Central Europe. And I would like to mention two works about, in which you try to compare the situation in Czech Republic and other things. Next year we will publish a book about censorship in Czech and Hungarian academic publishing. And you are now working also on the post-Yugoslav feminist activism in the 21st century. And I'm really looking forward to the results, because I think that this comparison between the Soviet socialist bloc and the Yugoslav self-administration socialism is very important, this seminar. Well, that was my introduction.
Thank you.
You have the floor.
And a lot to live up to. You didn't catch the names of the books that Matteo mentioned. No worry, I'll have some promotion in my presentation. Thank you very much for the amazing introduction, and thank you, Anna and Janine, for the invitation. Here. For giving me this very daunting slot of 2 hours. I actually noticed that only like a week ago, I thought it was an hour. So I said, oh no, 2 hours. So I had to extend my talk. So, well, now if it's too long, we just say, shut up, because we are tired. So I did my first degree in Anglistik, so in English and American Studies and in sports science with a teaching diploma. And we were told in the numerous psychology classes that I had to take that psychologically a person cannot concentrate more than 45 minutes. And we were told that in a 90-minute lecture. So, hence, it seemed too much to say, look, just skip. We are tired. And so, without further ado, although I should probably say something about what Matteo mentioned about the Yugoslav thingy. There's actually a special issue of Women's Studies International Forum that I'm co-editing with Zorica Siracic. And we are pretty much done. I'm now on the last edit of the last article plus the introduction. All the rest is already, all the articles are already online. So if you were looking for this special issue, you can already read the articles if your institution allows you access to this journal. So if you are interested, they are all already available. So that was the last, and now to work. What I will be talking about today, this is sort of a bit of a research that somehow developed also from the book that Matteo showed, because we kept, with the teamwork, and we kept coming across all these issues about gender, critical issues of gender. I call it gender critique in the state socialist period. And then one cannot not notice that, well, check historiography. Where is gender in it? Any gender perspective at all, among historians. And so I did this. If you were last year in Göttingen, was anybody in Göttingen last year? Good, because I did a shorter version of this. I was actually rather worried that I would cause the embarrassment of repeating myself. Isn't anybody from Graz? Nobody from Graz? Oh, there is somebody from Graz. Okay, because we are supposed to be studying partnership, right? Where do you study?
Gender studies.
In gender studies?
Yeah.
Oh, so we will probably see each other next year.
Yeah, we'll work on our master thesis.
Oh, okay. So we won't. So I need this master's in English gender studies. Yeah, okay. So this is what I've been talking about today. And now, have you ever come across this movie? Have you seen it?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. So you know that the Oscar-winning movie from '96, a Czech movie. And so František Louka, the protagonist of the Oscar-winning Czech film Kolja, lets the soldiers of the occupying Soviet army into his house to wash their hands and offers them water, rather than banging the door in their faces, as one would probably expect in a story set in the last months of state socialism. The viewer is led to believe that Louka was a victim of the normalization regime that set in after the occupation in August 1968, that he was ousted from his place in the leading orchestra due to his political views. Later in the movie, however, Louka waves down this story, putting his misfortune down to personal rivalry on the part of his fellow musicians rather than to political persecution. A gender scholar could not then miss the tender fatherly care with which Louka gives a bath to a 5-year-old, and of course the bonding between him and little Kolja that carries the story. In other words, the movie leaves almost no stereotype, political or cultural, unturned. The one stereotype that does remain concerns representations of women and women's roles. For example, Clara, Louka's romantic interest, accepts and even appreciates his possessive advances toward her. The message being that that is what women are waiting for. Diana Georgescu sees Kolja as being successful in changing official narratives of European belonging, while relying on, quote, highly gendered scripts that proved more resilient to ironical workings. The stereotyping of women in Kolja does not stop at sexist portrayals of private relationship, but is carried over to the political level in the character of Mrs. Zubata, Miss Tusey, played by an actress made up with an unflattering overbite. She represents the social services and comes to take Kolja away, assessing Louka, a man, and a bachelor as an unsuitable carer. The representation of state social institutions as bureaucratic, even inhuman, is not subjected to ironical questioning, and it actually works well within the narrative. Yeah? It is also a trademark of a good tragicomedy that at one point the laughter stops. In Korea, that happens with the entry of Mrs. Libora on stage and gives the movie a chilling twist. I would disagree, though, with Veronica Pecker's otherwise perceptive analysis that the film offers, quote, a predominantly benign portrayal of the period, end quote. Zubata also means, as you know, if you don't, so you speak speakers, also means the Grim Reaper, dead dog. Yeah? So no matter how jokingly Lonka talks about her, there is no escaping her or the machinery of the state. Giving the machinery a distinctive female face then reveals the deep-seated sexism of the Czech cultural imaginary. When I say cultural, here I do not refer to products of cultural institutions or creativity, but to the ways the social relations of a group are structured and shaped, and, quote, also the way those shapes are experienced, understood, and interpreted, end quote. Korea thus illustrates a symptom that extends well beyond mainstream cultural products. Similar gender blindness and its fellow traveler, sexism, plagued many a discipline in Czech academia, including contemporary historiography. With the exception of a handful of specialists, gender is rarely, or not at all, represented in the works on state socialism in Czech scholarly history writing. Granted, to be able to take advantage of the potential of gender as a category of historical analysis, to generate new knowledge, requires at least some background in gender theory, and that is not everybody's cup of tea. But when one considers the prominence of the equality of the sexes in communist rhetoric, and the heated anti- and pro-feminism media intellectual debates of the 1990s, of which you may have read at some point somewhere, then this omission testifies to a remarkable loss of opportunity in historical research and actually defies logic. For if emancipation and equality, rovnoprávnost, were such a strong presence in the pre-1989 discourse, and women constituted, as everywhere else, half the population, does it not follow that the plain demographic fact should drive the interest of researchers to inquire where this population was, what it was doing, and what it had to say? Seeking answers to these questions would produce descriptions and minor archives for sources. A deeper analytical level would then be achieved if researchers systematically mobilized the category of gender, even if they remained just within the gender binary. What this half of the population doing or saying? Now, was this half of the population doing and saying different things than the other, and why? So today I will first consider the status quo of gender blindness in greater detail, and then look into the possible reasons for this phenomenon among Czech historians and its consequences to post-1989 interpretations of state socialism. And I have to reshuffle my presentation because I can't see it, sorry. I put it into this professional presentation folder, and the light is thrown on it exactly in such a way that I can't see it. So, we'll do a typical disorganized sheet of papers. It will drop on the floor at some point, and I will lose my imagination. But we'll see. Don't worry about the number of sheets, okay? It's printed large so I can see it. I still can't see it. There you go. That shows. There we are. Much better. Goodbye, functionalism. So the weak representation of historians in research on gender issues of state socialism is a bit of an anomaly, even within Czech gender history. The publications on the 19th century women's movement and women's social and cultural participation are numerous. And I actually gave you as a handout some selected bibliography on which I draw, but I left out the Czech sources in Czech. So if anybody is interested in Czech sources, just give me a shout, send me an email, and I'll send them to you. Or Grace, of course, Libora sitting right there, who has another pile of these sources.
Yeah.
And I'm arranging a workshop later, to which I will definitely come, because I think she will extend what I'm saying to history literature.
Yeah.
Good.
Something.
Yes. So some of these, most of these sources on 19th century women's movement, except Jitka Malečková's, fall under women's rather than gender history. The interest has been gathering also around the interwar period, although significantly few publications exist there. When one searches for gender perspective among historians of state socialism, however, one encounters almost exclusively only two names, Věra Sokolová and Denisa Nečasová. Věra Sokolová was the first to address such topical issues as forced sterilization of Roma women that began during the Nazi occupation, and the lives of non-heterosexual people under state socialism. And here is my moment of self-promotion, because a lot of people actually publish in this book. And Denisa Nečasová began to fill the gaping void of our knowledge of the relationship between the state women's organizations and the Communist Party. Thankfully, that is not all the gender work accomplished thus far of state socialism. An increasing number of researchers ventured into this field, scholars from literature, cultural studies, sociology, and even legal studies, but not historians. The Journal of the Institute of Contemporary History of the Czech Academy of Sciences, Soudobé dějiny, has published 2 articles employing gender and narrative category since its foundation in 1993. Both of them appeared as late as 2011. Rudolf Kučera's useful overview of mainly German language literature on masculinities in 20th century wars that specifically mobilizes the category of gender and gender history, and Anna Hayková's account of women in the Theresienstadt ghetto that also explicitly uses gender. The journal has covered topics such as ecology, social memory, television and film, biographic research, migration, leisure, cookbooks and cuisine, social policy, and history of everyday life, but not one touches on gender analysis, although on all of them there is rich international literature that includes a gender perspective. The Institute of Contemporary History itself then does not seem to have gender aspects on its agenda, which is all the more surprising because the leading figures have had many and long-term cooperations with researchers from mainland gender milieus. Miroslav Vaněk, the foremost Czech oral historian and the head of the institute, has been working with gender researchers associated with the excellent Center for Narrative Research at the University of East London. Michal Kopeček, head of the Department of Late and Post-Socialism, has never shunned gender researchers and invited them to present at various events. Indeed, together with Pavel Kolář, he co-authored an extended overview of Czech post-1989 historiography, in which the authors mention gender history in several places and specifically identify institutional conservatism as a key obstacle to its development in Czech context. Kopeček's department also employs 2 researchers with a previous history of gender research or interest in gender-relevant topics, Petra Roubal and Adela Juričová. Petra Roubal's work on state socialist mass gymnastic performances was concurrent with the international scholarly discussions on the body that thrived from the 1990s onwards. Adela Juričová worked on in the 2000s on Růžena Vacková, a woman intellectual and a political prisoner, and later on eroticism and nudity in post-1989 public space. But just like Roubal, has moved to a different area of inquiry. One would assume that under the pressure of Czech academia, double international publication metric, have you heard of anything of the discussion? It's a huge discussion. You have to publish, and of course, the better metrics, the more the better. So an institution would want to make the most of the expertise of their staff and encourage them to develop topics in the areas into which they have already made inroads, which have already proved to be eminently publishable internationally. Moreover, as a diagnosis that I just pronounced, we are analyzing an underpopulated area. There are no researchers in the field. Yeah? So there is definitely the potential for both the individual and the institution to stake a territory and make a mark. So it's basically neglecting a field where there is nobody there, so people can publish in it and be famous instantly, and yet they don't research it. Now, what are the reasons for this reticence in addressing gender in the research agendas of contemporary history? In the context of the legacy state socialism left to social sciences and humanities, we can identify at least three interrelated reasons: the legacy of expertise, discipline legitimation, and epistemological legacy. Jitka Malečková showed how communist historiography co-opted the 19th century women's movement into its dominant narrative of the national movement. This contributed to making the women's movement as such invisible in the communist account of history. But it also produced a side effect. Talking about women's place in history was not a taboo, and there was a community of historians knowledgeable of the issues and sources. The approach through movement then provided a conceptual framework. It can be argued that work within that framework had the necessary contextual preconditions to continue also after the demise of the communist ideological domination. Research work on the interwar period does not have the movement framework available as legitimizing device, because after the creation of independent Czechoslovakia in 1918, national movement is no longer a mainstream paradigm for Czech historiography. This research also begins to appear later than the work on the 19th century, namely after other legitimizing contexts were established, such as President Masaryk's support of women's equality issues, repressions against the bourgeois, women's associations after the communist takeover, and the martyrdom of the leading figures of women's activism. Františka Planíková, who was executed after the assassination of Heydrich during the Second World War, and Vera Horáková, who, as you probably know, was executed by the communists in a trial. Thanks to these other frameworks and contexts, researchers on both periods can make do with writing about women rather than gender. And actually most of them do exactly that. Researchers interested in state socialism by comparison find themselves in a very different situation, without a legitimizing context and without a pre-existing conceptual framework. And this now requires a more detailed explanation. I argued in another article that the pernicious legacy of communist ideology, at least with regard to critical approaches to gender, was to produce the notion that women's emancipation in Eastern Bloc was a communist idea. Gender historians such as Melissa Feiger, Jitka Malečková, and Melissa Nečasová had shown how it was accomplished discursively and in institutional practice by taking over women's organizations, their property, magazines, and the narrative of the women's movement. The sociologist Hanna Harotová had argued that the Communist Party took over also the agenda of the women's movement, and she coined the term expropriation, or she wrote it originally in the German as in your handout, so she called it Enteignung. No, so that was for the overall, the term for the overall strategy. It follows that any forays into topics concerning women or gender in state socialist era would be at risk of being seen as aligning themselves with the communist ideology. In fact, Kolář and Kopeček's diagnosis, which includes gender history by implication, holds here, and here is the quote. Due to the insufficient examination of the legacy of Marxism, new theoretical approaches to historical writing are often considered to represent a quote return of Marxism and thus are violations of history. The belief in value-free research and the possibility of separating lies, therefore myths, from the truths and scoring knowledge is constitutive of most Czech historiography and quote. In the 1990s, there were certainly voices from among the ranks of emigre intellectuals that then endowed with considerable moral capital that saw a parallel between feminist politics and communism. Part of the problem was the vocabulary of equality of the sexes and emancipation of women, used by both of these discourses. It could therefore hardly provide a viable conceptual framework for inquiries into state socialism and gender history. Also, research from the point of emancipation and equality wasn't a viable framework to research from. Yes, please.
May you slow down a bit?
a bit difficult to follow.
Slow down.
Yeah.
Thank you, yes, I will do so.
Thank you.
I always tell my students, please tell me to slow down. Additionally, the 1990s brought the revival of a key epistemological discussion of the 1960s and the Prague Spring, the call for pure science in social sciences and humanities. In the context of the 1960s, it meant a scholar's right not to work within the explicitly ideological doctrine of Marxism-Leninism. It is then hardly surprising that the feminist emphasis on writing from a clearly articulated political agenda proved indigestible in the Czech post-1989 scholarly environment. The unfortunate consequence of the pure science doctrine is positivist objectivity, or use Donna Haraway's term, gaze from nowhere. For the purposes today, I will call this universalism, because history written from this position makes universal claims, seemingly objective, value-free, unaffected by researchers' positionings, and by the social relations of knowledge production. In contrast, current gender research, as you know, and this is a bit of a revision for you just to give the background to my argument, current gender research builds on the impulse of feminist epistemology that had begun in the 1980s and emphasized partiality and situatedness of all knowledge and knowledge production. This work followed, among others, from the ideas of Louis Althusser on ideological state apparatuses and Michel Foucault on discourse, that laid foundations to the post-structuralist turn in social sciences and humanities. Of the many twists of the term, the one important for the present argument is a turn away from the pursuit of impartial, universal knowledge and toward the acknowledgement that all knowledge comes from somewhere. Ideology, discourse, or the unconscious, depending on which theory you draw on. Is it better?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, good. Okay. If I forgive myself, shout. Don't ask politely, just shout, okay? So in the context of these discussions, all that feminist epistemology does is require that the researcher lays bare and reflects on her own ideological premises and therefore on the reach of her conclusions, and does not claim universal validity, because that makes the knowledge gained from those conclusions more precise. No? Logically, you all know that. From a universalist perspective, however, therein lies the limitation of gender approach to history writing. Yeah? So the claim is, well, because what all these feminist and gender researchers do, they only cover a small area, it's less valid. It's too small. Times have changed since the 1990s, and working on areas that featured in communist rhetoric perhaps no longer threatens researchers with loss of legitimacy. There is little ground to believe that this kind of continuity would still apply. The doctrine of pure science and the goals of universalism are a different story, and not only in historiography. Petra Hanáková noted the aversion of mainstream Czech film studies to gender analysis, Jan Matanoha in literature, and even in sociology, which has a respectable body of gender specialists, it is a rare occurrence. Even an article on a general topic cites a single work with a gender focus. It follows that in this context, gender history or gender perspective of history can only be seen as a marginal field, a subfield of real history. And if one chooses it as a research orientation, one may risk one's status among historians, which for a junior academic equals a diminished prospect of employment, logically. Now, sorry, there you go. The obvious consequences of the near absence of gender history and analysis of state socialism are blind spots and lost knowledge, and the loss of knowledge being particularly relevant in oral history. Małgorzata Fidelis in Poland, Donna Harsh in the GDR, and Ildiko Astalos-Morel in Hungary showed the influence of gender stereotypes in party politics, on women's employment status, and material conditions in industry and agriculture. There are just some examples of nuanced analyses that challenge the notion of the communist commitment to the equality of the sexes. With the exception of Nechasová's book, there are no counterparts to these works in the Czech context. The sociologist Marcela Linková concludes her afterwards to a recently published book of interviews with women dissidents with the following bewilderment, quote, "From today's perspective," that's it, I switched my slide, sorry. From today's perspective, it is particularly interesting to ask why we have not followed up on the continuity of the lived reality of women's emancipation in the Czech lands after 1989, and why it is continually crowded out of our historical, social, and scholarly memory. It is truly astounding that we do not have research available on central issues of the communist ideology such as women's employment, health, education, or consumerism. And note these down as your thesis topics, okay? Those of you who speak Czech. Nobody has been there before you. You're absolutely original. Such research is necessary not only for a comprehensive understanding of state socialism, as Sandrine Koch and François Pivot asserted, but also of continuities and discontinuities since its demise. If we do not know where and how represented women were in various professions and fields of study, for example, we are lacking a basis for understanding development in these areas since. There are also less obvious, although equally great consequences. Lack of precision in the interpretations of history, and a heavily gendered, one might say, Collier-esque account of history. The precision issue is down to the pure science doctrine and universalism, and plagues even works that step well outside of the mainstream in many other respects. Michal Pullman, for example, who some of you may know, challenges the dominating totalitarian model for interpretations of state socialism in his book Konec experimentu, The End of the Experiment, and presents the refreshing and conceptually much richer thesis of an ideological consensus between the rulers and the general population in the last years of state socialism. How much more subtlety and depth would his argument gain if he included further categories into his analysis of the leading dailies and of party documents, not just gender, but also age, social status, and ethnicity? The result would have been a rich fabric of the relations between the various social groups and the communist power that would allow the hierarchies, positionings, and perhaps also vested interests and motivations of these groups to come into the fore. But that doesn't happen. It's it challenges does amazing work in challenging the totalitarian paradigm, but remains at this universalist level, the view from nowhere. The lack of depth and precision due to the neglect of gender analysis is regrettable, but largely to the cost of the author, because he could have reaped greater benefits from his considerable labor. And it is corrigible. Somebody else can take that work as a base and continue the analysis. Accounts of history delivered through highly gendered scripts, however, cause damage to all historical knowledge. Paradoxically, sometimes distortion occurs when authors discover gender. And Jiří Pernes's book, Komunisti s fanatismem v srdci, is a case in point. It includes the portraits of 10 women, all of them active Communist Party members, but with a variety of life trajectories, from the unrepentant communist functionary and normalization actress Jiřina Švorcová to the Charter 77 signatories Ludmila Jankovcová, Marie Švermová, and Gertruda Sekaňová-Šapetová. It is hard to divine wherein lay their fanaticism, other than in the simple fact that they were all politically active women. Why is Gustav Hlučíková's steadfast following of the doctrine fanatic, while Julius Hlučík, her husband, is merely enthusiastic, zapálený? Statistically, the leadership of state socialist institutions and organizations was prevalently male, and therefore a far greater number of male Communist Party members would have political activity and unflagging adherence to doctrine as the common denominator. Yet there is no book that would apply the label fanaticism to them as a defining feature. The explanation that offers itself is that political activity is coded masculine, which makes the women with that characteristic unfeminine. The historian remains locked within a stereotype that corresponds neither to the political demographics nor to the social dynamics of the latter half of the 20th century, but dates back rather to the era of the early 20th century suffrage movement. The prevailing public opinion then took the very notion of any political participation of women to be a contradiction to the definition of femininity and the women's role. Now, that's 19th century. But to make this argument in 2003, it's really sort of almost 100 years behind times. The female face of communist fanaticism posits a disturbing counterpart to Mrs. Zubata and another symbolism in her character of the state machinery in Korea. Disturbing because it too espouses a popular notion rather than results from an analytical reflection, as one would have every right to expect from a work of historical scholarship. Another kind of history writing, through highly gendered scripts, is the opposite of what I just described. Blindness to one's own gendered vision of the world that translates into methodological flaws and results in gender asymmetries in historical accounts. The history of Polish Solidarność is by now a notorious case brought to light by Sheena Penn. She asked the obvious question: any broad popular movement attracts both men and women. So where are the women in the canonical narrative of Solidarność? She traced the process by which women's voices and faces were erased from the history of the fall of the communist power in Poland. She presents a counter-narrative and evidence that it was, in fact, the women who saved the movement during the time of the martial law. Her archaeological work has been recently continued by Maria Gido, who is specifically interested in the women's perspective on the narrative memory of Solidarność. We know from both these revisionist works that considerable power was at stake in constructing the narrative of Solidarność that made women invisible. Nevertheless, the gendered coding of concepts like activity and heroism in public discourse also participated in this process of making them invisible. The history of the Czech descent, including the Charter 77 movement, shows a similar gender bias, as Jiřina Šiková, a Czech sociologist, pointed out a decade ago. She also identified some of the gaps in the narrative that ought to be filled with women. The recent publication by Marcela Líková and Nadia Starková, comprising 21 interviews with dissident women, adds to this counterbalancing act of returning women into the story. I know that English translation is almost finished, but it's not out yet, so that it will be in English soon. Šikovás is the first brief outline of the problem. Linková and Starkovás a document, rather than an analytical counter-narrative like Penn's. And Allah, all three authors are sociologists, not historians. Huh? The Velvet Revolution of 1989 has so far fallen victim to the discursive masculine coding of concepts associated with public political expression, with no redress in sight. The invaluable collection of 100 interviews with the student leaders of 1989, the 100 studentských revolucí, so 100 student revolutions, by Milan Otáha and Miroslav Vaněk, includes only 50 interviews with women out of 100. To his credit, Vaněk, in co-authorship with Pavel Nuke, has made an effort covered greater gender sensitivity in velvet revolutions and oral history of Czech society. The book draws on 300 interviews and includes 139 biographical notes of the narrators quoting within its pages. Although only 56, so about 40% of these belong identifiably women, but some it's difficult to say from the name of the quotes whether they identify as male or female, which hardly corresponds to the demographics of Czech society. The authors include several gender-relevant topics and make numerous explicitly gender insights. The topics include pregnancy and contraception, entering marriage, and family and masculinity. The authors observe, for example, the following, and I put some of the quotes only selectively on the slides. So one quote runs like this. The men's reluctance to talk spontaneously about their families may have stemmed from the traditional gender roles. In their eyes, it was their job to look after the material well-being of the family, the world of work. Men born in the 1960s would more likely provide a more balanced view of their lives, including the roles they took on in the family. Another quote, young men were mentally immature, simply much more so than their spouses. I have to say that sometimes some of these quotes, which are analytical, are basically paraphrases of what the interviewees said, and actually the deeper reflection is occasionally missing. Another quote, despite legal provisions, women were discriminated against in their earnings and rarely appeared in leadership roles. Another quote, some of the women interviewed questioned the term maternity leave, which in Czech implies a holiday. Many female narrators joke that it must have been coined by men because no mother, knowing what such a leave entailed, would ever consider a holiday. Another one, in addition to satisfaction in a well-made product, women workers often stress the pleasure that they felt in being able to match the men. Aside from the dissatisfaction about being unfairly compensated as compared to the men, women cherish the feeling of being appreciated. The respect they got in the workplace could sometimes make up for the lack of recognition they got from their families. Even if these were communist honors, the narrators were highly proud of them, end quote. And finally, this quote. Men and women remembered their free time from different angles. Men basically separated their time into two categories, work hours and free time, with family time as a side topic. Women also divided their time into two major categories, the workday and family time, with free time as side topic. Even that mostly spent with their families, end quote. So all of these are acute and perceptive observations on the gender order of state socialism, and by extending its legacy. They would have gained in theoretical nuance if the authors had drawn on literature by gender researchers. The bibliography, however, includes almost nothing from the rich research in gender history and on gender relations under state socialism. The last of the quotations is particularly remarkable because in it the authors begin to move from the men versus women perspective to gender as a category of analysis, namely to the restructuring of time through the lens of gender and the gender order. They achieve a perspective that is still wholly absent in the voluminous and slightly early publication Volný čas českých zemí 1957-1967 by Martin Franz and Jiří Knapý. These two authors are also not entirely gender blind when they discuss whether prostitution should be seen as an economic activity rather than as a hobby, as it was sometimes categorized in the period of their investigation. There was an official categorization in communist statistics. Yes? Prostitution is a hobby. No? It's a free time activity. They also note the inequality in the availability of free time to men and women, but the typology of how people spend their free time lacks any gender reflection. And yet, it is profoundly gendered. It includes various forms of recreational travel, hiking, they call it tramping, summer camps for children, TV watching, collecting, do-it-yourself activities, model making, and socializing. Conspicuously missing are any traditional handicraft activities mainly practiced by women, sewing, knitting, crocheting, embroidery, lace making. In a book engaging gender, this could be a conceptual decision by the authors. making clothes for the family or homemaking could be categorized as work rather than as a leisure activity. Unfortunately, nothing suggests that this was the case here. Rather, women's free time and the gendered nature of free time fall beyond the field of vision of Czech historiography. Consequently, women's perspectives are written out of the history of state socialism. It is not that the author would have done sloppy research, quite the opposite. They went through an awe-inspiring mountain of archival and published material. But again, how much more fruitful could this effort have been had they systematically included gender into their approach and analysis? Judging by the precedents of Sheena Penn, Donna Haj, or Malgorzata Fidelis, the work had a paradigm-changing potential, but that potential was not used at all. And that is, exclusion from history extends also to the history of expert discourses, namely academic disciplines. In May 1989, Martin Potůček asked Czech social scientists, among other questions, what the damage and lasting consequences had been to their disciplines during normalization. And Miroslav Purkávek, a sort of older generation of an academic, wrote, and you have a quote there, I consider as the greatest damage to sociology the drain of talented men from sociology, or rather low interest in the discipline from among the young generation. Younger sociologists are ever more frequently women, end quote. One would therefore assume that sociology was a heavily feminized discipline during that time, and presumably also post-1989, if it was mainly women who were trained into the field. Yet, the 200 pages of the more than 600-page tome of Dějiny české sociologie that are devoted to the period of state socialism give the standard narrative from one great father to the next. The only woman that deserved a separate section on her work, introduced with the heading, was Erika Kadlecová, a sociologist of religion. Other women sociologists are mentioned here and there, but few are granted more space than one sentence or a discussion of any of their works. The 38 pages of bibliography for the chapter on state socialism include fewer than 70 entries with women's names as authors or co-authors, and that includes translations, so it is translations of somebody's work. That is less than 2 entries per page. Per page, single space of a book about this big. Certainly no feminization in the canon creation of the discipline. It might be that Purkávek, in his statement, was exaggerated, and that what he diagnosed as drainage of male blood meant in reality that more drops of female blood dripped into the field compared to the 1960s, but that men still remained in prevalence. And here's my second moment of self-promotion, okay? In the light of my own oral history research of Czech scholarly publishing, I rather conclude that although young men may have not entirely disappeared from sociology during normalization, there were also a considerable number of active female researchers. I was specifically looking for informants who were recommended by their peers as respected for the work they did already during socialism, so between 69 and 89. And there was no shortage of women in the recommendations. Excluding them from the history of the discipline results in a distorted picture and consequently a false legacy. Now, and here's my conclusion, does Czech historiography need to be concerned about all this? I would say it does. A demand for a comprehensive and accurate description of the past, as well as theoretical and methodological precision, is more than a feminist grudge. Both professional standards and the international standing of the discipline are at stake. To remedy the current situation, work is needed in 2 areas: gender balance in research, and including gender as an analytic category in historical analysis. The former, so the gender balance, does not require any specialized knowledge other than a demographic reflection. What is the proportion of men and women? And let us stay just within the binary, gender binary, even that would be fantastic. fantastic if we have that, okay? I'm afraid the gender diversity is not on the books yet. No? So in the given area, what was the proportion? The researcher's obligation is then to make sure that the ratio is at least approximately maintained during data collection and the final written account. The latter, so employing gender analytically, does require mastering specialized knowledge, and not everybody is prepared to do it, and not everybody has to. We do not all have to be gender researchers. What we do have to be, however, is aware that gender exists as a category of analysis, and that including it will have consequences for interpretation of almost any topic in history research, as will many other categories such as class or ethnicity, or sexual identity. Both the universalistic and the genderless produce biased or partial visions. There is no way around it. The difference is that universalistic interpretations are guilty of unreflected bias, while gender analyses lay their bias and therefore limitations bare. If we do not consider gender, class, ethnicity, or other possible categories that are likely to lead to different results of our analysis, we need to say that, and thus signal clearly that we are aware of the reach of our conclusions, and that is only good practice, as we all know. Thank you. Questions?
Wir sollten noch ansagen, Sie können auch auf Deutsch fragen.
Ja.
Also, es wird auch verstanden, wenn jetzt jemand nicht so.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this enlightening and very short speech. I expected it to be a little bit longer. I wanted to know if there are any policies from the state, from the Czech state, to change this. Like, for example, if there is funding aiming at women to enter certain topics, or if there are state funding for new professorships dealing more specifically with gender-related topics, is there any political will, so-called, that would aim at changing this structural sexism?
It's a complicated question, actually, because the simple answer would be no, but then would be also biased. Because are there any dedicated policies? No.
Okay.
Am I right, Eva? Yeah. There are no policies, right? None. But it doesn't mean that gender doesn't get funded. Okay? Because I mean, we've had a master's in gender studies since, gee, I put a date somewhere, 2007?
Yeah,
2007.
When it was split.
Or earlier, yeah. And then we also had a BA in sociology, in gender studies, which no longer exists, but that was from 2004, which means that there are people, educated specialists, who are now in their 30s, some of them in their 40s, and they actually are instead of in quite a few places. And so there are. And it's not just the graduates, but also other people who are sympathetic to the issues. So what you don't see in the Czech Republic now is what you see in other countries of the former Eastern Bloc, and if you don't see to the extent, is this anti-gender campaign. It still is there, but my argument has always been there. There has never been a golden time. Yeah? It's always been basically this hill, climb uphill. So now, the change is that now there are people who actually understand the field. And so, yes, women's organizations get funding, not always, and not as much as they would like to. Gender research does get funded. Yes, we are also labeled as activists and not scientists, and gender should be taught at universities, yes, definitely. But this argument has been there from day one, yeah? And
I think something's changed now, actually. Sometimes the gender is quite popular among the European projects, and even men are just coping with this because they feel that there are some money there.
Yeah, that also. The money works, yes. Also for this is unfortunate because a lot of people who actually have absolutely no qualification for gender apply for European funding because it says gender, yeah, and they get a project and they actually have no gender specialists within their teams. But I think we are not probably the only, I mean Austria. Czechs are not the only sort of ones guilty of this, yeah? But what I also sort of know, because we do have an ear in the government as well, that Babiš, as much as we hate him for everything else, he doesn't care about gender. Like it's not a subject. Yeah? It's whatever works, whatever is practical. So he's not going to go on a campaign against gender.
But the most important thing that the president is just against gender, and he is a really chauvinistic, and he is actually the leading figure, and he is a role for so many people.
That is true. Yeah.
That's very great.
Yeah, he doesn't hold the money.
Yeah.
The president rules the public discourse.
Yeah.
But it's the prime minister who holds the casa.
Yes.
Yeah?
That's why it's possible to apply for grants.
Yeah, and so I think the recent, when I sort of got sort of an insider information from one of the governmental discussions, was that somehow there's been a huge issue that like the asylum or the safe houses for women, for abused women, somehow the government committed a long time ago to build them, but nothing happened. So supposedly, Babiš, as much as he's an authoritarian, says, well, let's just build them. Now, is he gender-friendly? Certainly not. But it's not a topic. But the dedicated professorship? Ha ha ha. It's also, the Czech system is different. We don't have dedicated professorship for anything. Yeah, professorship is something like, it's a qualification, it's not an appointment. Like in Germany, Austria, it's a qualification that an individual earns through promotion. Now, of course, it's political as well, but once you do your habilitation, then the same way you do your professorship.
But does that mean that the institutes at the universities have a greater range of freedom to set down
Yes.
agendas, what they want to teach, what they want to spread?
But I mean, isn't that the same here? The institutes decide what they want. Of course, you have to have something in the overall, what is it called, now I lost the word, the Entwicklungsplan, yeah, for universities.
Yeah, that's true. There again, I perceive it a little bit more institutionalized, that once a professorship is designed, at least as long as the person is appointed, this won't change, and only when the professorship gets vacated.
Yes, so here it would be when a department, and programs, or the accredited programs, the degree programs, the fight would be there. Yeah?
Okay.
And the bachelors in Brno just lost that fight. Although I think it was partially suicide, but you know,
But it is very difficult with this accreditation process, because nowadays it's very tough to get in, and now not only this Brno bachelor, but also Prague Charles University, the master in gender studies could be really in a big trouble.
well, we hope.
We hope not, but it could be.
Yeah, really.
Because it's just so many obstacles. And now we actually at academy it is a little bit different, because gender studies are somehow Charles University and Masaryk University, and even Olomouc Palackého somehow implemented somewhere, sometimes into some programs, because there are scholars there who are just trying to promote it and trying to work heavily, and the young generation is very actually keen in this optic.
But that would be the same, you know, in Austrian or German environment, because you know, in Graz we are a university of over 30,000 students, and mine is the only professorship with a gender designation. No? There's nobody else only sort of officially responsible for teaching in gender studies. Yet we have, I don't know, 24 scholars at least. Also some professors who specifically do feminist and gender research. Another question.
You mentioned that the other humanities are not that badly gender blind, so that maybe art history, literatures are more open to gender questions. So, and I found your reasons for this gender blindness really interesting. And do you have an idea why does this apply to historiography and not so much to other humanities? Because basically it could be also relevant there. But why?
Well, in other humanities, there's also this vitriolic rejection, except sociology. Somehow, I don't know how this happened, but it happened already in the 1990s. That gender studies was seen as it's part of sociology, which is really strange because we know from the history of women's and gender studies that it actually comes from literature. In the German, Austrian context, I don't know, but in the Anglo-American, which is what mostly the researchers read in the 90s, there it came clearly from literature. In the Czech Republic, it was always attached to sociology. So to the point that, oh no, it's not, the historian would tell me, oh no, it's not relevant for us, it's in sociology. Yeah? But somehow there are researchers in other disciplines, such as Libora and others, who do work on state socialism and gender issues in state socialism. But somehow just not in history. But why is it in history? I guess that's a question that in my paper remains unanswered. I really don't know.
Maybe it has a very strange historical connotation because gender studies, just after the revolution of this 1989, were connected deeply with Jiřina Šiklová. Yeah, Jiřina Šiklová just was the only person among dissidents who was like, oh, she is gender. She has a very nice gender studies library. Oh, maybe let's just begin even at Charles University with her, and because she is a sociologist, and then firstly it was somehow affiliated with social work.
No, but the history is different because I was actually teaching in that first course. I'm that old, okay?
Yeah, I know. Thank you.
No, it was in the early 90s when Jiřina Šiklová, a sociologist, because she had the moral capital of a dissident person, she basically was at that time, if you were a dissident, you got a lot of what you wanted, particularly if you were thrown out of the faculty. So there was this move of getting these people back into academia. So Jiřina Šiklová got back, but she didn't, I think she wanted her own department of social work. Because social work, again, was a field that wasn't studied. It wasn't accredited. It didn't exist. And so she wanted to establish a department of social work as a discipline, as an accredited program. And in it, at that time, when you put together the accreditation portfolio, you had to put in what are the minimal standards. And she put in as minimal standards gender expertise. And therefore, that field became established within social work, not by sociologists, within social work. And but even then, when she came up with the idea to have the first course to teach, and we called it the traveling exhibition, the traveling course, because we taught at various universities around the country. Always one or two people had 1 or 2 lectures, so there were like 10 or 12 lectures in the course. There were no historians. Oh no, there were historians who did 19th century, but there were no historians doing modern period, and it just didn't become established in history. Okay, I remember the name now.
I would like to rely on the last question and put some reflections and also make some questions for you both. I like this concept of the reflection of bias because, well, my perception as a literary scholar doing Czech studies, but coming not from Czech Republic and who grew up in the Western world, the capitalist world in the 80s, is that also in literature, for example, you have, let's say that there are mostly the young generations of scholars who want to reflect about bias. Because they don't think, as the majority of the older generation, of course there are exceptions, that science has to be objective and science has to be universal, and they don't have this fear to deal with Marxism as something bad because it is not neutral, not universal. Younger scholars, they want nowadays in Czech Republic, for example in the field of literary studies, to differentiate about different forms of Marxism. They say there is a pre-68 Marxism, a post-68 Marxism, there are a lot of schools of Marxism and so on. So you cannot say Marxism is like Leninism, Stalinism, and there are a lot of leftist words are what to be researched. And also they think in this tradition of post-68 New Left that every one of us is biased, and that the very fact what you can do as a scholar is to reflect about your biases, not to say I now try to be objective. And so there is this very interesting, let's say, discussion among literary scholars between an older generation which who is very, very close to structuralism, because structuralism developed this idea, okay, we will speak about things and we will avoid ideologic traps. And the post-structuralist new generation say, no, ideologies are over everywhere, Althusser, we were quoting Althusser. So let's see how to reflect about our biases, our own biases. And well, my question is if you think that things are going to, let's say, systematically change with the generational change, let's say, if older people well, will not lead anymore some institution or not. And another thing is how is it possible that there is this fear also among older people to speak about, to differentiate about Marxism? Because if you try to say to some older dissidents, okay, your position and the position of Havel are not that different from New Leftist position, they say, we are liberals. Yeah, that's
yeah, okay, so to pick up on your literary score, actually Althusser get his basis of this idea from Pierre Macherey and his theory of literary production. Yeah? So that's the idea of that it's all ideology and you can sort of read between the lines. Yeah? Although Althusser doesn't allow for the reflection because it's not there. It's not possible. And that's the limitation of this image. So that's why you Foucault it. But you say the older generation that they define themselves basically as we are liberals, we are not Marxists. Your question also has a bias, and it's a biological bias. Okay, what do you mean older generation? Okay, it's been now 30 years since '89.
Yeah.
So the dissidents. I mean, I showed the book cover of my upcoming book. I did the interviews, the first interviews for the book in 2003, 2004. I think 1/3 of the people are dead. Okay, and only of the 30 people I interviewed, only I think still 2 are still active, and it's on the Hungarians who were younger. I have 2 younger people there. But all these other people are no longer active. They are in their 80s basically. They were born in the 20s, 30s, so they're no longer active. So if we are talking about academia today, the retirement age is 65. Yeah, and so some stay longer. It's not like in Germany or Austria where you have to retire at 65. In the Czech Republic you don't. But basically, biologically, the numbers are small of the older, still dissident generation. Yeah. So it is yet the younger generations.
Can I make it to
yes.
side? There are between, let's say, old people who belong, right, to the younger generation again, but let's say people who were born in the 50s to the 70s, people who consider themselves as they took up the heritage of this sense.
Yes,
so they
exactly. That's what I'm going to say. This is the heritage. And how does the heritage get there? Now, I have a theory, which I haven't published anywhere and won't unless I do proper research on it. So far, it's just experiential naked eye observation. Is that if you look at the development of Czech educational system from the 1990s onwards. You had this period, you already had it underfunded because social sciences and humanities for political reasons in the 70s and 80s. And then because we now need to build our new economy, so universities have to wait, particularly social sciences and humanities. So it was further underfunded. Then there was this wave of, no, we have to somehow compensate the people who were thrown out in 69, 70 during the purges after the occupation. So, no, the Soviet occupation. So we have to bring these people back in. So less funding, more staff. So we can't hire new staff. So for a younger person or a fresh graduate or PhD student to get a job in the 90s in academia was very, very difficult. So what does the people do? If they were intellectually curious or had the ability, they went abroad. To come back from abroad to the Czech environment is incredibly difficult. Yeah, I struggled with it for 15 years. I was nominally there, but basically emigrated. Yeah? In the end, because it just wasn't bearable any longer. I never thought I would end up in Austria, right? And there is lots of people like that. And a lot of them are leaving academia still because if they went abroad to got a different education, they were not welcome back. See, understate socialism, what you had, because people couldn't travel, the option to go and study abroad wasn't there. Then the best people stayed at universities. Yeah? That's no longer the case. Now it might be different again, but those who really were the best one, they left, and they weren't welcome back. Those who were the bright students would be then going to make money somewhere else, to go into the private sector or government or whatever. And so those who actually stayed doing their PhDs in Czech institutions were not necessarily the first or the second class. Well, some of them are, people like Michal Kuhlmann, Michal Kopeček. These are also born in the 70s and they are excellent scholars, right? But a lot of Denisa Nečasová, right? I don't know how old you are, so I'm not talking about you. That's what I thought. So then, sorry. And so you would have these people who already weren't at the top of their classes, who learn from their professors, who are this generation. What can they learn from the professors? And if they are not the brightest students, I always call it like the, what's the word for the English or German for Oates-Indruchová? It's the, you have a square root, so we do the square root reverse. Basically, it's exponentially less. And so basically it's the material that's there, and it's a closed world that really isn't open to outsiders. But that would be sort of a roundabout response to your question. So why is the place so conservative? Am I right? Roughly? Jimmy?
Yeah, I would like to ask about the sources of the research.
Mhm.
The sources of women in socialism, for example, because you said, well, we need a more precise interpretation of the history. And my question in mind was, well, but what about the sources? Are there sources, or do you need especially the oral history to find out something? What about the times where you won't have the possibility to ask
Yeah. So that would be the question, and you would have to ask the question in the context of women's studies and gender studies as a discipline. Where does it start? And if you look, it starts in the 60s in the US and Britain, and then quickly spreads sort of eastwards, right, to Western Europe. When you look at these first works, what did they draw on? How did they do work? They did the same kind of archival work that they were taught to do in the disciplines, whether they were literary scholars or whether they were, or interpretive work, whether they were historians, psychologists, whatnot.
This is more of a question. Are there sources?
Well, that I'm going to get there. And so they could could also say, well, there are no sources. Well, how do you know no sources? The point is that if you go to an archive, you have an index, right? How the archive works with headings. So of course, nothing that has gender in it, or women, would be there. But that was the same for these researchers in the 60s. They had to go through, do this amazing work, and then create, correct the indices in the archives, create the labels. I followed for a while the catalog of the National Library in Prague, which would be again a wonderful resource to have a look. How did the cataloging practice change over the last 40 years? For example, if you look in the 1990s, I did 2 anthologies of text, that's what I know, okay? If you look into the catalog, there is the label, women's literature doesn't exist. Somehow, toward the end of the 1990s, early 2000s, it appears. So you can search by women's literature. Same in bookshops. The bookshelf called women's literature certainly didn't exist in the 90s still. Now in the late 1990s, we have a book section, women's literature. Now what is it? Of course, it's interesting to see the selection there. See, so it's about labeling, categorizing, classifying. So the archives are there, whatever the archives are. If you want to study gay history, and in, I don't know, German Middle Ages, well, what are your sources? The sources aren't there. Well, there are, you just have to look for them. And here it would be the same, which actually with the communist ideologies, because women and emancipation were such powerful labels. It's actually, they are there, the sources. They actually scream at you, women. Yeah? Gender, they don't use, because the terms really didn't exist. So you would have to, as a researcher, bring the perspective in and look for sources where that could be. But if this book on free time, there is what did they draw on? They were some archival documents of civic associations, but also the specialized magazines. Yeah, just like today you go to a traffic, you will have all these magazines about modeling, cars, sewing, Burda, yeah? All of those. These were available, not Burda would get imported from Germany, but at the time, but there would be Žena a moda, all of these. The researchers chose not to look into these. They looked into aircraft modeling or railway modeling, yeah, or gardening. But they didn't look into these. So the resources are there, but the researchers don't see them.
Thank you for your fascinating lecture. I have one question. I was wondering if you're working on the role or position of women who belong to the Communist Party. Because I truly believe that communist women did something for the emancipation, and I also believe to the generation what Prof has already mentioned. So I can say the state socialism wasn't so bad. So, and I think we have to take a closer look on the role and the position of communist women, and I think it is a gap in the research, because they are not taken into account now, for my feeling.
I would never say state socialism wasn't so bad. In relation to what? To Nazism? Yeah,
no,
you are right.
The capitalism.
If I were to live in that world one more day, I would commit suicide. I'm serious. Okay?
Yeah.
Like, no.
Yeah.
Because what is actually often missing, and I think this is actually used as an argument for against the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes, a word name I know, when they want to research everyday life. It says, well, it's not a big topic because we need to study the oppression, but actually you will really get to the depth of the oppression when you study everyday life. One of the first things I was asked to write was in the mid-1990s, I think the publication is completely lost now, was to comment on interviews with 3 generations of women from among dissident circles about just everyday life. And I read with one family, 3 generations, so mother, daughter, mother, and grandmother. And what I noticed in those interviews was this ever-presence of violence. The violence was at so many levels, so many forms of violence in their lives. From the beginning to the end, it was violence, to which they were exposed from the state, from their spouses, from the parents, teachers, from everywhere. Yeah? And they never once mentioned that word, nasiri, violent. It was never mentioned. The accounts were completely dispassionate. It was just everyday life. Yeah, it wasn't nothing special to talk about. It was just there. And when I wrote my piece reflection on this, the editors of the journal were very displeased with me, because they felt like, how can I write about violence? That it was really disappointing that that's what I picked on. That they exactly wanted to have this narrative of like heroism and how the women cope, and all I could see was violence. Yeah, so. It's always relative, of course, and yes, we know that what the communists did for whatever purposes had a positive side effect on women. And when we compare with today, some indicators definitely have gone down since then, such as women's access to certain educational areas, women's access to, let's say, birth control, for example, although we could debate that, okay. Women's access to positions of leadership. We perform badly, of course, labor market. I mean, Austria started the women's movement in the 1980s, right? The Austrian women's movement. And so that's when women begin to enter the labor market, it becomes a topic that women enter the labor market. When I look at the recent statistics, Austria has a larger percentage of women in the labor market than the Czech Republic. And Czech Republic starts in 1990 with 98% of women in full-time employment. Yeah, which included, of course, women on maternity leave because that was considered in full-time employment. So Czech Republic now, so women are out of the labor market. That means low pensions, that means financial dependence, all of these. So in that, of course, socialism did a lot for women to make them also independent, or empowering stuff for women. Like in the 1990s, international companies were some of them preferred hiring women than men, because as a women have languages, they are more resilient, they have organizational abilities, and they are flexible, they adapt better. The Czech men just don't.
But they were also loyal.
Yeah, it was, I'm loyal.
Absolutely loyalty. And why it was, it is another question. And we need, as you said, a really deep insight of what was happening during socialist time. Because there were lots of other contradictions towards this emancipation from above. Actually, why it happened that we in Czech Republic had 4 years maternity leave? Why it happened?
Hannah Havelko actually writes about it. Why it happened. Yeah.
It is absolutely anti-women stuff.
Yes.
If you consider consequences of this, it is awful and nasty, but it was a choice of women. Why? Because they were fed up with all these. Actually, it was not right to work. Work was obligatory. If you could not.
No. If you were a married woman, you didn't have to work.
But somehow
it was perfectly okay if you were married, a woman didn't have to
with
work.
the kids.
Yeah.
Definitely.
But also with how it happened that we had a 4-year maternity leave. Hannah Havelko documented actually that came from the State Population Committee, which was represented by both men and women.
It is only one case of it.
Yeah.
We have lots of other cases. Why the loyalty is really very, very important things, and this home as a place of revolt was also so because many women were forced to be at home. Just the public life was not so acceptable. And of course, for example, what was happening after 1968 was so many men were sacked because of their activity during 1968. Lots of men lost their jobs. They were forced to work as workers and so on. And many women, what they did, because they were loyal to their families, they entered Communist Party, and what does it mean? What did that mean? They were able to work on a high position because only as a member of Communist Party you could obtain the higher.
Yeah, but that would be the
And
same.
then they were not satisfied with the Communist Party. Okay, they were members of Communist Party, but they were definitely not communist.
But Liba, that would be the same for men, and statistically there were fewer female members of the Communist Party.
But what is the point is, women were working for their families mostly. And because they were forced somehow to care about their family more, and they were more loyal to the state.
So we would have to research it deeper.
This is the problem,
Yeah.
because we are talking from the leftist position. I am not talking from the leftist position. And naturally, this is the problem. We are now discussing, oh yes, we need to adapt leftist position to understand. Yes, we need, but we need to understand what's on the other side of the sword. I am biased, I know, because I really don't want to say that the state socialism was very nice towards women. Was not. Because as you said, there's lots of oppression inside everyday life.
Yeah, but it also, in the context of the response to Anna's question, the oppression when it comes to was not specifically against women, but of course it has to do with the deep-rooted sexism.
So I'm not defined violence and oppression. I'm just asking about the role of women in Communist Party.
So just the officially Communist Party or the party state had this. When we talked about human rights, they meant group rights. That's known, rather than individual human rights. So an individual was in service of a group, the group being the socialist state. And so hence all these sort of legitimized state violence at everyday level, which then of course extended to women doubly, and we know that from gender analyses that institutional symbolic violence, such as in prisons or wherever, has a different impact on women than on men because it's masculine coded or comes from a certain logic. So that would be the same answer, but it's not specifically it's anti-women. It comes from a deeper context of politics and institutional practice. But the women in the Communist Party, that you asked about, we don't have enough research on it yet. Yeah, there is Anita Oates-Indruchová who does the research. There might be some masterarbeiten. But basically, that's the problem, that it's not researched.
We don't know anything about it. And we don't know anything about more and more things. That's really terrible.
First, second.
Thank you very much for the lecture. And, I'm also studying post-Soviet space and gender in it, particularly visual arts and culture as well. And the thing that I'm dealing with a lot is that there are lots of Western sources that write about gender in the Soviet Union or pre-Soviet Union, and they are very interesting and precise in their gender analysis. Usually they misinterpret things, they don't have enough sources, and I find myself always like rewriting them, checking them, like adding information. There are lots of gaps, and there is, for example, this famous book by Betty Friedan that is about feministic in America, and she actually prizes the women from post-socialist countries because she says that they are not trapped in this femininity, they are working, they're living their lives, and she takes a very positive stand on it. But of course she's not analyzing the amount of work, the amount of work that women did at the time, because they didn't only work at home and at their work, they also produced things like sewing and, I don't know, like doing stuff, but they weren't able to buy it also. So it was like enormous amount of labor that they did that like wasn't visible for her anyway. And do you feel the same with the sources on probably Czech lines that are published in USA or in the USA or somewhere else?
If you look, because people say, oh, it's been hardly a subject of study, but are not interesting for the West. Well, actually, if you look into the 1970s, then you can see, Czech Republic on the map is about this much, the map of the world, or even less than. So, considering how many studies and book-length studies there are, it's actually a lot, from the 1970s, I would say. It's a matter of perspective. And I did read them, obviously, I had to read them. Some of them are written by people who emigrated, so they knew the situation, but then they emigrated in 68, 69, and so they would always refer to the situation before that time, into the 50s and 60s, writing about 70s, usually 70s. Some of them are written by American or other scholars who travel frequently. Some of them are amazingly perceptive. Some of them find sources that Czech researchers so far have not touched. There's like the first analysis of the women's, of the journal, the magazine of the women's organization, Vlasta, was actually carried out by an American. But what you are saying about they misinterpret and there are missing pieces, and how you found it in Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, 1963, the textual beginning of the women's movement, right? It's logical, it's everywhere in these, because women's movement, particularly in the US, because there are multiple American researchers here, it defined certain agenda which was important for women, specifically women, not lesbians, not bisexual people, for women, at that time in their societies. And then, because they knew there is this other world, because the West is in competition with the Eastern Bloc, so let's go and see how it's done there, because then we can embarrass our governments. I mean, that would be the people like Nane Fang, that would be the agenda to present arguments why their government should put more funding and more effort and better policies. Because look at the evil communist world they are taking over in such an important category. So what did they do? Logically, they took their agenda from home and they brought it with them to the Eastern Bloc, asking the questions which are important to them politically and as scholars. So they didn't ask a lot of other questions that we are now asking and finding these gaps. So it's, again, the same process that I did in my presentation is to step back and look at, okay, why do we have this question? Why do we have this gap? What is the larger context? Please.
Thank you for your deep insight into your experience as a scientist. I had two questions, and I wonder why you distinguish between women and gender studies. For me and for us in our history, this is a process coming from the interest in women's history, in women's situations, going to gender. That this is a question of gender in the end, but it's from the very beginning it was to know about women's lives and women's history. So the underside of history, as it was one of these slogans, has to be discovered first. It was not part of the normal and established history science, historical science. So I didn't understand why because before the 90s we talked about there were no women's research. And the second question is joining to this. I think historical science had a very bad situation at the beginning of the 90s at all, because it was a break in history, and it was the philosophy of the end of history. And so, as I saw in Germany, it was historians had no stage anymore. It was the sociology, the politics, yes, and the literary sciences. So because of this post-structural discourse approach. And historical, I think in your country, in the Czech Republic and the Eastern countries, there was a double break, as well as in the political situation, as well as in the philosophy of those who are now saying, have the very to say. So I don't wonder that it was very difficult to study history at that time in the Czech Republic, because those who remained in the university had a difficult standing, I think, as you described. And so I didn't quite understand your blaming the historians in this moment. Yeah. So because it is obvious that it was difficult, and to talk about gender today is an important is imported also into your country. It's also coming out from the experience of the lack of knowledge about women. It was perhaps something that came from above as a discourse and not as a lived experience. So maybe
another hour?
Because
Do we have another hour?
I could say it in English as well.
I'll try short. Okay, so women's and gender studies. Well, I'm making a distinction. I'm making a distinction because we always have to think of the broader historical context of the discipline. And if you talk Germany, for example, US, UK, then yes, first what we're going to see is let's fill in the gaps in the 60s and 70s. So let's make women visible. But then, 1984, John Scott publishes gender as a relevant category for historical analysis. That's the correct? And there she defines what it is to treat gender as an analytic category, because by then gender appears as a term. Sometimes in the late 70s, it appears in feminist work, gender as a term appears, I think, then only. And she says, well, this is not to write a history of women at all. It is to write from a gender lens, and this is what it means. And we move to Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, 1990s. All this is already in place. Yeah, and of course, in an environment where gender studies don't exist as a discipline, and so the distinction between women's history and gender history isn't clear at that point. Not even the researchers themselves, who sound like Vítka Malíčková is perfectly clear. Yeah? But we have also, so that's why I want to distinguish which works are using just doing the visibilization work or the archaeological work to put women back into history, and which people are doing the gender work to look at history as through a gendered lens, whether it is to talk about free time, or whether it is to how free time under socialism, or whether it's to look at Czech law, how it was structured at the time, or how it developed, or to look at, I don't know, heterosexual people. That is no longer women's history, that's gender history. Yeah? And so that's why that's just how I distinguish because of that. Yeah, because if you're in the 1990s, when you have the field developed in the discipline internationally up to a particular standard or phase, then Czech historians or literary scholars or sociologists cannot just go to the beginning and repeat that whole history, because they could never publish in an international journal if they just did their own little local thing. And actually, many scholars, such as myself, or Hanna Havelková, if you know her name, we were always doing dual work. And she specifically says in one of her articles that she's basically doing this consciousness-raising work in her Czech publications, while she's doing feminist work or feminist theory in international publications. I've been doing the same. I haven't published in Czech for ages. What I am known for in the Czech Republic is exactly for trying to build a particular discourse for introducing works through translating anthologies of translations of classics. Yeah, actually, probably a few people in Czech Republic know my English work, and that's what I'm known for somewhere else in other circles, at home, which is home right now. But in the Czech environment for this translation work. So that's a historical issue. End of history, again, different context. Certainly not end of history in the 1990s in the Eastern Bloc, where there's a complete explosion of history, where there is this amazing interest in rewriting history, because of course it's common knowledge that the interpretation of history which was taught at schools or published was heavily biased, subjected to the doctrine of Marxism-Leninism. So now we have to rewrite history, to do it properly, to write the truth finally. Yeah, so it's universalistic.
And were women included in this process?
Well, we have, unlike in Germany, we have very few, relatively, we have very few staff changes. There are a few people who had to leave universities, but mostly people stayed, and then others came in. Yeah, but we didn't really have this profound change where basically staff is thrown out and new staff who actually doesn't have the experience of no relation to the place and time of history is put in place, such as what the situation was in Leipzig University. Yeah? And so you have, there's a major interest in history, and of course there are female historians, there are lots of women in history. And some of them wrote these amazing works about women's history, about the women's movement in the 19th century. But generally at the time there is a little interest yet to do proper archival work in the discipline of history on state socialism. It was way too close to home. People wanted to research something else. But also the people who did write about state socialism sort of created a certain master narrative. And that hasn't been challenged. It's been now 30 years. We are talking for a young generation are now people who are finishing their doctorates, or finished doctorates, who were not even born in 89. Yeah, so that argument no longer holds, that, oh, it's just, we have to do something else. It's young people. And you said, of course, the complex of post-structuralism in the 1980s, that doesn't reach Czech Republic, Liba, when does post-structuralism become even acceptable as a perspective? 2000s maybe?
2000, but nowadays it's over, even this post-structuralism.
Now it's over, right?
It was not implemented, but it is over.
Yeah, it's over, exactly. Because I couldn't do my habilitation in the Czech Republic because I was raised, because I did my studies in the UK, and I'm, of course, an unapologetic Foucaultian post-structuralist. That perspective, so I could never do habilitation in the Czech Republic because of the structures. But same thing, oral history. People like Miroslav Vaněk, whom I quoted hopefully not too unkindly, they had amazing problem with having the method legitimized. I mean, much worse than gender studies. We had a degree in gender studies in 2004, a department of oral history in at the Academy of Sciences is set up in 2010. So there's a much more vicious fight there about what even belongs to history, which methods are allowed to be used as legitimate. Yeah? And you said, last point, that gender perspective of feminism was imported, and now I need another hour. Because I disagree. Yeah? Because yes, if we take Gerda Lerner's definition of the feminism as a system in which, according to which men, a system of thought according to which men and women are to participate in the creation of the world they inhabit in equal measure, if there's a loose translation of the quote, then no. As a system of thought, of course we didn't have it. Feminism is a system of thought. Gender studies didn't exist as a field. But it doesn't mean that gender work isn't done. And it's because of the emphasis on emancipation of women of the state socialism, that meant that there was money for research into that kind of thing. And we found bibliographies of stuff published under state socialism about the status of women, education of women, statistics which can be absolutely used today for gender analysis. Yes, there was actually a huge amount of research. Was it done from the perspective of contemporary international gender research? No, it wasn't. And so we can talk about, I call it gender critique, but it's not systematic. You know, methodologically it's flawed. Yeah? And if you look in the early 1990s, there's this outburst of publishing and on gender studies and feminist issues in English and German among Czech academics. And those belong to the highest cited papers internationally from the Eastern Bloc about the time. And they publish in really high-profile publications. And if you look at the bibliographies, they draw mostly on Czech work. And by 1994, this idea that, oh, it's an import appears mysteriously from nowhere. It's not in the early 90s. In the early 90s, it's an engagement, it's a dialogue. By 1994, everybody starts citing, oh, it was imported. And I wrote a whole article on it, where I go into the history and I try to track it down, how we ended up with this import. Yeah.
Last question.
Yes. I have another question about the Western perspective, so-called. So you said that in the 60s and 70s, Western things that were researchers went over to state socialist states and got a lot of things wrong. And I want to ask you, what's your take on the quality of Western research regarding Czech or state socialist issues today, and how we can maybe avoid or tackle the danger of the Western bias, which is always there regarding feminist or gender issues?
Okay, so historically, we talk about 1970s. So the major limitation would be access to sources, yeah, for Western researchers. Because who can they talk to? I mean, there is this book which is quite frequently cited called Women Under Communism by Barbara Wolfe at Janchar, which when I read it in England in 1991, I was horrified how bad it was. Okay, that there is a whole book on women under communism written from the interviews with exiles and from official statistics. Yeah, so only somebody on the inside would know, well, these are not exactly reliable sources because we know that official statistics are falsified. And well, talking to immigrants, well, they have a bias, obviously. Yeah? But these are the only sources which were typically available to draw on without having a research grant, obtaining a visa. To go there when foreign research would be, of course, followed by secret police. You know, it's amazing material obstacles to doing research. It's like, no, any of us today trying to go and do research, I don't know, in Palestine. I mean, I have a project at the moment in Gaza. Setting up and announcing a master's degree in gender studies at the Islamic University of Gaza. That's not next year. Really, that's not a joke. We really are. But you know, I'm accused all the time by my counterparts in Gaza what mistakes I make, how I misinterpret. And I'm thinking, you know, I do have the experience of having grown up in a state of surveillance. I know that I can't even ask certain questions. I can't even hint at certain things. I cannot take what I'm being told at face value because it could be all these things. But yet, what do I know about the life, everyday life of women in Gaza when I'm actually forbidden to travel there? Because, you know, Austrians can't travel to Gaza. You know, people, attention Austrian institutions, for security reasons. You know, so I'm trying to do something. I hope I'm achieving something. I'm doing my best to reflect and avoid bias, but I'm sure I'm guilty of all sorts of transgressions of misinterpretation. But I think that the best we can do is to reflect. Reflection is the best we can do. We can, of course, try to educate ourselves and then to reflect and say, look, these are my sources. So we have to clean on the methodology so that the bias is transparent as much as it can be. Did I not answer your question?
No, okay, I just, I'm a Polish studies graduate and wrote a lot about gender studies, and so I always had this like thing, okay, you're a feminist from Germany, so can I even do what I do without stepping into so many, was heißt Falle?
Pitfalls.
Yeah.
Well, yes, you can. You will fall into pitfalls, though. But you need to accept that, okay?
Yeah.
There is a beautiful article on this. There's this big handbook, which I'm sure you know, is the Handbook of Feminist Research, is it called? And there is an article on feminist ethnography. And I forgot the name of the author, because I might teach it in my feminist methodologies course. It says exactly this. So, okay, because now we have all these demands by feminist methodologies on ethics, on really, the ethical and the representation. So it's better if we avoid doing certain research, because then, we won't be blamed if we go wrong. Well, what is the consequence of this? Nobody will do the research. So we do the research, we'll be blamed for correcting, for making mistakes. So at least it's out there, so somebody can go and correct the mistake. But at least we try to open a topic. Does that help?
Yes.
I know it's not very encouraging. But
Yeah, yes, actually.
then whatever you do, you'll be blamed for it. Yeah?
I'm looking forward to that one.
So, this was the last question. So, Libora, we thank you for the lecture.
I thank you.
And also for reflecting about your bias and our bias with us. We will continue to do it in the next days. And that's important because reflecting about bias is difficult, but listening to others speaking about their bias can be even more difficult if you don't think that their bias are fancy. And sometimes you think, oh, how boring your bias, but it's important to sit down and to listen to. So thank you for the good work, and I think that Anna wants to say something about the logistics.